It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, John Tolva. I'm going to let John tell his own story, but I'll just say a few words about him before we get started. John has a background in English, but has built his career in technology and urban design and engineering in both the private sector and for the city of Chicago as their chief technology officer. And I know John isn't going to say this, so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that in 2012, the White House recognized him as a champion of change, which is an incredible honor, and I am very excited to hear from him today, both about his personal journey and his insights into how our work can better connect with businesses and how we can think about preparing our students for careers in the business world. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to John.
Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the chance to speak today. I am, in fact, John Tolva, and maybe just give you a little bit of personal background because I think it may be the most relevant part of where I've landed after 25 years or so in business. I have been in the private sector most of that time, but as Maureen mentioned, I was in the public sector with the city of Chicago for 3 years as well. So I've seen a variety of sides of it. So just as context, and you don't normally say this in a speech, but I'm 44 years old. I grew up in Chicago and went to undergraduate at Vanderbilt University, where I majored in English and music, and loved it. And when that was finished, after 4 years, I wasn't finished sort of in that world. This was all, if you do the math, this is all just pre-internet. The web boom hadn't happened yet, but I was always kind of a tinkerer, a builder. I was first drawn to computers really just for word processing. Writing and language were always my first interests, and it just seemed like another way to explore that. I suppose I started with an IBM Selectric typewriter, but that quickly moved to word processors. But all of that to say that in my undergraduate years, I was 100% committed to the humanities, largely because, engineering and science hadn't sort of come to the forefront of popular culture in the way that the web had brought it. But as I said, I wasn't done diving into English, and so I went to English graduate school at Washington University. It was a PhD program. There was no master's involved. It was straight to PhD, and this was the mid-'90s, and it was right around the time that you may remember the granddaddy of all the graphical web browsers was born at the University of Illinois, called Mosaic. And when I first saw that, and first saw the potential of network information sources, firstly as a research tool for my own graduate work, but then, also just kind of extrapolating that to commerce and entertainment, it struck me that my field of study was very related to that. So I was studying the cultural impact of the printing press in Renaissance England, sort of cultural implications, not the, just the fact that many more things were able to be disseminated, but the invention of copyright and the invention of the notion of a sort of stable author, and indeed what people were writing, the content of what they were writing, sort of being shaped by the knowledge that there was a technology in the publication flow. And it occurred to me that the web could be something similar to that, or its implications could be as well. So I was at about the 2-year mark in the PhD and decided that I actually wanted to turn those critical and analytical skills to this new medium itself, which is that built on some work that I had done at Washington University, something that exists today, actually. If any of you are Edmund Spencer scholars, the 16th century poet, we built something called the Spencer Archive, which was the very beginning of what is fairly commonplace now, sort of digital archives for the primary, materials surrounding, poets and authors and artists and things like that. But kind of, sort of excited and emboldened by by that world, and also being a very lone voice in a fairly traditional English department, I decided to transfer. I transferred to Georgia Tech. They have something there called the School of Literature, Media, and Communication, which is basically their liberal arts wing. Of course, it's an engineering school, but they had just started up a program that was really defined the next 20 years of my life, which is basically taking a humanist approach to technology. So both in its critical analysis, but also in its creation. Not coding for coding's sake, not computer science for computer science sake, but sort of contextualizing that both historically, but also understanding the implications of sort of human-centered design, which in the mid-90s was fairly radical. And so I graduated and was newly on the job market. Georgia Tech obviously is in Atlanta, and I got a job with IBM, which may seem like an unlikely place for someone with the interest that I just described, and I suppose it sort of was. I guess I was newly married and needed a job. The good news is a company as big as IBM had realized actually quite a long time ago that if all they did was fill their employee ranks with computer scientists and engineers, they'd pretty quickly fail. I spent 13 years at IBM, and by the time I left, only about a third of the employees there had technical backgrounds. A lot of this had to do with a shift towards design, sort of understanding the human experience in, whatever industry they were going after. But also, I think it was just a maturation of the notion of what makes a good company. Monocultures of any kind are extremely fragile, and they had realized this. So I had been there for, I don't know, maybe a year, and there was a division inside of IBM that did cultural heritage preservation and digitization, and when the web hit, dissemination. So I was able, the colleagues from that period joke that, I was given that assignment mostly because I was, the only kind of humanist, though they wouldn't have said that word, but the only, person that still read books in the office. That may or may not be true, but I was lucky enough to basically lead the digitization efforts at a few different places. The first was the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, which at the time, very few, and even today, very few Westerners had visited. It's easily the size of the Louvre, and it's all Western art, actually, from Peter and Catherine's various plunderings and purchases through Western Europe. But what was interesting about that was, this is very nascent technology, right? We're talking this. I don't even think Chrome and Safari existed. This was the browser wars of Netscape and Microsoft Explorer, and nothing worked right from one browser to the next. And here we were trying to virtually open the doors to artifacts that very few people had seen. So kind of pushing the boundaries there, but also trying not to replicate the experience of just walking through the halls of a museum. That's very special. That's very spatial. And it's a unique kind of cultural consumption that the web wasn't really very good at. So definitely learned a lot about that, and also got into the field of hardware because these things needed to be scanned. Some things were flat and could be scanned in 2 dimensions, but many things, the sculptures and numismatics and things like that, needed to be scanned in 3 dimensions. So did that, and I can certainly go into more detail about the individual projects, but they increasingly they increased in scope as the years went by. We were engaged by the country of Egypt, actually, to digitize and virtually recreate a number of tombs and tomb complexes that had deteriorated so much from actually human breath and human footsteps that they were basically off limits. So that moved further into the real world, if you want to say, taking the skills of preservation, but really recreation, or in some cases repatriation of artifacts that were elsewhere, and sort of a virtual repatriation. That was called Eternal Egypt, and that was all the major museums in Egypt, about 9 different archaeological sites, and not just the Pharaonic period either, all the way up through the Greco-Roman and the Coptic period and Islamic art. So I was sort of rapidly becoming this sort of dilettante, so almost art historian, because of this merger of new technologies. But that grew in time into a project with the Forbidden City, which is the very center square kilometer of Beijing, now known as the Palace Museum. And that was, the kind of the apotheosis of this idea that we could use online technologies to represent context that's been lost. If you know anything about the Forbidden City, the artifacts that were, it was a city. It's 800 buildings. It was a lived experience for many, many people and courtiers and royalty. But during the Chinese Civil War, most of the artifacts and documents that were in there were, squirreled away by Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. And there was a museum there called the National Palace Museum, which is not a palace, but it is the location of the things that kind of gave cultural relevance to the place in Beijing. There's also a bunch of stuff in Nanjing. And so partnering with those 3 cities, this was a period of relative détente between Taiwan and the People's Republic. We were able to recreate those 800 buildings architecturally, virtually, in a sort of multi-user immersive space, and then to place the artifacts back in their context. So definitely not like a museum, more like more like a simulated city or sim city. And in many ways, we were capitalizing on the gaming vernacular that existed at the time. But once we got to that point, this idea of trying to map out how a city worked, what it was like to be in it, was really where I think I found my calling. That is the city as artifact, the city as object to be studied and designed. And you could easily call urban design a member of the humanities. Cities are the most complex things humans have ever created and probably ever will. Partially because it's a distributed creation. There isn't typically one person at its helm, but because there are so many sort of unintended consequences and implications. But that doesn't mean that it's a purely engineering task. There's plenty of cities in China today that were done that way and nobody lives there, because the city is not a sum of its infrastructure. It's not a sum of slogans. It's not a sum of anything physical, really. The reason we like to live in city, 2007, you may know, was the first year in human history that more people lived in cities than not on the planet, and that doesn't look like a trend that's changing. It exists. That trend exists in parts in North America, but really it's sub-Saharan Africa and the Far East and the Middle East that's having that demographic shift. All of that to say that this was the birth of the smart cities movement, and I was still at IBM at the time. But what was clear to me is this sense of how do we optimize a city using the only thing that it has more of than it used to, which is data. How do we use that data? The term big data hadn't come around yet, but how do we analyze that to find patterns that help us make lives better? And that's not that different than the analysis skills for giant corpuses of text. Sort of simultaneous with my kind of professional trajectory here was the birth of something called digital humanities, which you probably know about. And I kind of kept, I kept an eye on it because it was interesting to me. But, much of what digital humanities is pattern recognition in big data. Giant corpuses of text. And for the most part, at least in the early days, that is what big data analysis for cities was. And I had no formal training in any sort of urban science or urban planning. But that's really, it occurred to me that this is a humanist pursuit, and that some of the failures of technology in cities were because they lacked that. Not necessarily my particular skill set, but that there was a surplus sort of engineering talent or political in charge of this design. So I left. I was asked by the brand new mayor, this is 2011, of the city of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, if I would be the first chief technology officer there, which was, interesting, because if you look at me on paper, I don't have any of the credentials for that. And yet, some of the work I had done opening up data, and certainly my ability, and this may be the biggest reason that he hired me, is, and this is one of the sort of special talents of people in the humanities, the ability to translate between disciplines. In my case, to translate between, sort of the worlds of city governance and technology, or in the case of Egypt, translate between, the cultures and things like that. I mean, if I had to say that there's, a single soundbite or nugget from this talk, it would be that, and it's not just about city design. I think as technology has become part of every aspect of life, and in many ways the world has become more complicated, what we need most are people to bridge those gaps. A sort of multidisciplinarity. Obviously, we need specialists to go deep, but I feel that humanists are uniquely placed, and that the private sector recognizes that. I mean, you can see there have been plenty of articles written over the years about, specifically looking for these kind of skills in, med school applicants or in technology firms. And now, sort of at the advent of artificial intelligence, there's an absolute consensus that it's more about humanist traits, context, sort of social analysis, than it is about just sheer knowledge, right? Just consuming dictionaries and encyclopedias. That doesn't make an artificial intelligence. It's people who know the structure of language and how that changes the way we actually think. So just back to my career very briefly, served as the CTO for the city of Chicago for a few years. Took my experience to an engineering firm and sort of remade it as a, that's even funnier. I mean, it's one thing to be the CTO of a city. It's another thing to be the head of an engineering firm, and still, sort of pining to finish my English dissertation at some point. Kind of taking a data-driven and really even storytelling-driven approach to the engineering of city districts. The last of the personal notes here is that we sold that company because I moved to Denver. I'm currently in Denver, Colorado. Last summer, for family reasons, and started up a new company that Maureen mentioned. It's called Citify. It's a very small company that does consulting, sort of urban change management around sort of strategic planning and sort of master planning and roadmaps for cities that want to get ahead of changes that are clearly coming. So in some ways, this is a return to roots in the sense that I'm not actually developing any sort of technology. There's no software or hardware involved. This is really getting city leaders, private sector leaders that see something on the horizon. Let's use an example. See the autonomous vehicles on the horizon. And they want to understand the obviously political, but also the cultural and sort of social implications that from a policy perspective they're going to have to get in front of, such that there isn't another sort of regulatory mess because companies like Uber and Lyft caught cities largely off guard. And that in itself is not an engineering question. You wouldn't ask an engineer to tell you or even analyze for you the impact on affordable housing by autonomous vehicles. I mean, this is just an example off the top of my head. But that's what I do now. And I think what I would say is there's never been a better time for people trained in the humanities, and that can be just about anything, because the sort of the set of critical analytical skills that cross all the humanities is pretty much the same. There's a recognition that I've seen in almost all the major technology companies. That what's funny is you see you'd expect smaller startup, more nimble companies to understand the importance of creative teams and multidisciplinary teams before like an enterprise-sized company. But that's not actually the case. I think it's the older companies, Siemens and Cisco and HP and Microsoft and things like that, that recognize that real diversity of educational background is important. And for a simple reason. It's that they recognize that technology innovation is not to see the eyes through the world of the machine, right? It's to see the world through the eyes of a human, through the ears of a human, through the senses of a human, and shape the machines to that, or shape the software to that. And they don't teach that in engineering school, but they do in liberal arts colleges. There's a quote here from a technologist that I used to know. We've sort of fallen out of touch, but who went back and got his philosophy PhD. His name's Damon Horowitz. He said, "It is no longer just engineers who dominate our technology leadership, because it is no longer the case that computers are so mysterious that only engineers can understand what they are capable of. There is an industry-wide shift toward more product thinking and leadership, leaders who understand the social and cultural context in which our technologies are deployed." So, that's the world that I live in. My particular subject matter domain here is cities. But, what I've explained to people who've asked me why that is, really it's because the city is just the biggest problem there is. Or the biggest problem to be solved. It's also, one of the greatest engines of our world. But it could be anything. There are so many cases where the problem at hand is firstly to be solved by design, and humanists are designers, or students of design. Whether you can write a novel or not, you may understand what makes it particularly resonant to the human condition. And people with those skills are the ones that lead user experience laboratories and lead user testing groups, and even lead the groups of engineers who can cobble together the systems that meet the human needs as we go forward. So, I can sort of leave it at that. I'd love to have a conversation about this, but just to project into the future just a little bit, as the world itself becomes part of the internet, you've probably heard of the term the Internet of Things, sort of the physical instrumentation of daily life and the public way. There are plenty of dystopias you can conjure from that, and sort of graceless failures and cyber attacks and those sorts of things. It's going to, that world is coming. If it's not, it may not be evenly distributed, to quote William Gibson, but it's coming. And I think the greatest hedge against that is to encourage people who have sort of similar interests and educational backgrounds to myself, and that's you folks on the call and the people that you interact with and teach, to consider their skills applied in technology, in the fields more traditionally associated with design. I happen to think that cities are a real locus of problems to tackle, but you really don't want a world that's run only by the engineers. And I think we are lucky enough to live at a time when most engineers would agree with that statement. So Maureen, we're at about the halfway point. I'd be happy to open up to questions or dive deeper into any of the points that I've made.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a question already. So Brennan, go right ahead.
Hey, this is Brennan Collins from Georgia State University. And I'm really excited about your talk, largely because your interest in cities. That is the direction we've been going in for a good while, developing some projects around cities, some mapping projects, 3D projects, digital heritage projects, and getting PhD humanities students, history and English, working with computer science students and others. And so it's really exciting to hear your trajectory. We're far behind in terms of we didn't start 20 years ago in this direction. But I'm wondering, as students are getting this experience working on these types of projects, We're also, another big part of our NEH planning process has been getting internships for students.
Yeah.
And those two pieces haven't really been connecting so far, and I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of, we're kind of figuring out in the infrastructure at the university of how to set up the internships, and have a few that we're working with, a few companies, and we've started to talk to the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. But I'm wondering, this type of work that you're talking about is the most interesting, certainly to me, and I think to a lot of our students, that it kind of crosses that, it has its feet in both kind of a real world interest that they will have and the business community. I'm wondering if you have, like, who should we reach out to, or how do we reach out to companies, and do you have any internships available that we could send our grad students to for CityFi?
Well, to the latter question, absolutely. As we enter the summer, we should definitely talk about that, Brendan, and thanks for your comments. The question to ask is, what parts of the private sector, what parts of the private or public sector have levers in the city? The first would be city government. And I think, that's a tough nut to crack because, we actually, when I was with Chicago, invented the first chief data officer, which was an analytics person literally sitting in the mayor's office. And, I mean, you should have seen the looks on people's faces. Like, what is this person doing? So that's a tough nut to crack. But then there's other segments. There's the architecture and urban planning side. There's plenty of those in Atlanta. There's big companies like Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. There's little boutique shops. Most of them are at least aware that technology should be considered a design material, not just like I know GIS or I know how to draw 3D shapes, but that when you're planning a city, you literally need to be designing the way technology affects people. I mean, a couple of years ago, Mayor Nutter in Philadelphia released an April Fool's Day video where they painted a couple of the sidewalks in Philly with a texting and a no texting lane, which was funny at the time, but like that literally exists in China because there's a recognition by the designers of the public way that technology changes the way we navigate space. And all of that to say that there are certain architecture and urban planning firms that are looking for that kind of perspective. The other would be technology companies outright that have, big public sector verticals or who are, sort of in the smart city space. Panasonic, Verizon, IBM, which has a large presence there in Atlanta, Microsoft for sure, Cisco, Siemens. I mean, everybody, all of those companies have something. Now, to your question about, the difficulty of that, oftentimes you're not going to see an internship or a job description that lists out the skills that come from a program like yours, as I understand it. It just, that's the scary part of, what I do didn't exist 20 years ago. So how could I have, so one tip would be to have an actual sort of a concrete skill that's, part of the parlance of the industry. So, I know GIS, sort of use that as your foot in the door. Internships are not long anyway, but you sort of have to make this world from the inside out. You sort of get in there because you're good at GIS or you know how to do something else that they're asking for. And then sort of broaden people's minds and, you kind of change the conversation and your responsibility matrix once you're on the inside. So that would be my advice, and you're welcome to contact me offline. I think, I could, sorry, there's one other vertical, which is engineering companies outright. And these are companies like Arup and AECOM, they design dams and cities and things like that. But the thing is, they absolutely know that an understanding of cities from a non-engineering perspective, especially Arup, is really, really important. So, Maureen, what I could do is just put together a list of companies that someone who's specifically interested in this new sort of urban landscape should look at.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. We'd appreciate that very much. Yeah. Thanks, Brennan.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Just cut you off. We have a question from Amanda at UC Irvine, and she doesn't have a microphone, so I'm going to read out her question.
Okay.
And I think it falls really well on what you just said, John. You were saying that sometimes you need just like one particular hard skill that gets your foot in the door, and then you sort of change the culture from within. What she said is that they've seen that their graduate students have difficulty breaking into these types of fields because they don't have domain knowledge. The humanities soft skills that have to be applied to these specific domains, and they're being asked to talk about things for which they don't yet have experience. So her question is, how might PhD students learn about these domains, such as urban planning or tech, other than through internships? Are there other ways to learn about these things or to gain those kind of hard skills that will get your foot in the door?
Yeah, and I don't want to, Amanda, thank you. I don't want to overplay that card or that tip too much, because you certainly don't want to be hired into a role, simply because you're thought to be an expert in, one little skill. The point of an internship, in many ways, is to learn many things. I would say that a student, though, has a leg up on broadening horizons, being that they are in academia, right, where there are multidisciplinary courses. There's the opportunity to take some of these courses in other areas. But I guess the most important thing I would say is analytical skills is a hard skill. To me, a hard skill isn't just knowing a piece of software. And a lot of times these companies are looking for analysts, right, where the output isn't lines of code, but an analysis, a deliverable of text, which pretty much every humanist on the planet knows how to do. The domain, I get what you're saying, though, about not knowing about cities and things like that, but I don't know. To me, that's what an internship is for. You've got a set of skills, that form a bucket, but there's nothing in the bucket yet. There's been nothing put through the ringer just yet. So, but I don't know what position you have at UC Irvine, Amanda, but wherever there are opportunities to offer classes or even degree programs that cross these boundaries, and I know this is sort of an age-old conversation within the academy, it should be done. In the mayor's office, we actually took these policy, not interns, they were just out of policy school, and made them learn the tools for data analysis, because that really doesn't happen in universities. And so, the burden in some ways is there, or the opportunity is there to mix and match all kinds of different disciplines at the academic level before sending these folks out into the real world.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a question for John? John, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the, we had sort of talked about this on the phone a little bit, but maybe some of the cultural differences that academics might want to be aware of when they're approaching businesses for, developing partnerships, whether it's for internships or maybe for advice for how they might want to be structuring their programs or their professional development, what kinds of things. So, but basically just what are some of the cultural differences that might make it easier to or facilitate those kinds of conversations? Yeah.
Well, one, I would say, is the primacy in the private sector of collaboration. There are very few companies that promote sort of individual work, teaming and that sort of thing. And there's collaboration in the humanities too, but there's a lot of, sitting by yourself in the carrel and, having insights that way. That, I'm not saying that is, I haven't been in academia in a long time, but collaboration skills are, not necessarily taught outright, but it's the premium that's put on them in the private sector is huge. That's one cultural difference. The other is probably the pace and the acceptance, and I speak here primarily from the technology industry, the acceptance of failure, which it could be a big cultural difference, right? Not long-term failure, but sort of what is valued is a certain degree of risk-taking, whether that's new market development or new product ideas or just a new approach that have a fairly high chance of failing. I've seen again and again, and like for instance, I don't know if this exists in the banking industry, but in technology, that the ability or the drive to take those kind of risks is valued higher than the stumble that might result from that. And you may argue that that's not a cultural difference at all. There is much freedom of experimentation in humanities. There are plenty of examples. This is one of the reasons for tenure, but there are plenty of examples of taking an idea down a path that is just a complete dead end. So you guys would have to tell me if that's something, if that's a advantage that could be exploited in the private sector. But for instance, the reason I bring that up is in the public sector, in government, failure is not cherished, right? Risk-taking is not valued. And that is one of the reasons that that cities and governments are seen as so sort of calcified and averse to change and things like that. And that's very definitely a cultural problem, but not in the private sector. So, those are the big ones that I would highlight. If there's a specific, area you'd like to delve into, Maureen, we certainly can.
Well, I think that our other attendees would know a lot more about this than I do. They're actually structuring these kinds of internships for their students and having these conversations with businesses. So they're in a much better position to know what kinds of questions are coming up than I am. But so I'll just read a comment that I got from Ken Lipartito at Florida International University. He said that one of the consultants on their grant from their NextGen grant is Richard Florida, who had similar recommendations about where to look for jobs related to urban design, planning, and policy for humanists. And regarding analytical skills, one of our graduates has made a career in defense intelligence and says similar things about the analytical skills learned by humanists. It's a matter of rethinking how you present that analysis.
I think that's totally right. And another way to say that would be this is almost exclusively about repackaging yourself and having the confidence, right? This is about, personal marketing in a way. Obviously, there are sort of historical views in industry about, people from the humanities. But like I said, in technology, that's largely fallen away. But what, Ken, thank you for that. Part of this is almost coaching, students who are looking for internships or just careers outright into really valuing the skills that they have and recognizing, especially in the technology industry, most of the folks in there do not have these skills. There's just a certain pride. I think that, at least since I've been within humanities and postgraduate school or post-secondary, it's kind of depressing, right? The job market, right? And people sort of get down on themselves, and it's expensive, and there's as much doomsaying out there as there is positivity. But I hope I've conveyed to you the opportunity that exists, and that there should be real confidence in these interns. Not braggadocio, but like they have a unique set. of skills, especially as we push, and rightly so, push endeavors in STEM, really glorify engineers and astronauts. I'm all for that. But, what that does is further the divide between people with, real analytical skills and, those who are more in the science and engineering. So, I would argue even that it's more important than it was, or the opportunity is even greater than it was 20 years ago.
Thanks. So it looks like Katya Zeliat from NEH has a question. So.
Okay. Hi, John. Thank you so much for talking with us. And thank you also to Susan Brocksmith for suggesting your former colleague and friend. So maybe not former friend. So my question is, I think a lot of people who are trying to have a foot in both worlds, the academy and beyond the academy, are looking to find people like you, but it's hard to find people like you. Is there a support group that, that you're telling us about that we can find those people? Is it the process of going through alumni records? Because I think a lot of what I'm hearing students and also people at universities who are trying to help students say is, how do we get the network that allows us to know someone like John or someone like many of the people that we've been talking to outside of the academy? And that's one of the thresholds for students to think that it's okay to pursue a career like yours, but also to have the one-on-one. And cold calling informational interviews is one way, but you also have to be a very specific type of person to be able to do that. So that's in essence my question. How do we build a network of yous?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think you find people with this kind of multidisciplinary approach in every discipline. The problem is they may be good at bridging chasms within that discipline, but we're not so good at doing it between disciplines. Like I don't know whose careers have been analogous to mine in medicine. I'm sure they exist, but I don't know who they are or where they are. I think there are certain conferences that are kind of honeypots for this kind of person. There are plenty of non-technologists in technology, but they're not what we've been talking about, right? They're the marketers and the sort of business people. And I can certainly point you to those folks, but that's not really what we're talking about here. There are very specifically groups around technology and humanities, but that usually is technology in the service of humanist inquiry, so digital humanities. Library science has been absolutely revolutionized in the last 20 years, and a lot of people that think this way are in library science or information sciences, as sometimes rebranded. But it's a really good point. There's no like LinkedIn group or Facebook group that I know of for these sorts of folks, and it may be some time. I think it's only just now that in technology, this realization that there's a kind of a false dichotomy between the left brain and the right brain. But, I think in the popular imagination, that saying probably will be around for a generation. And so it may take some time for those social networks to reconfigure. But, Katya, I'd be happy to help point you in the direction of folks like this.
Thanks, John. I will mention that there is actually a LinkedIn group called PhDs Outside of Academia that does exist. And
but that could be like a bioengineer.
Right. Yeah, it's a whole range of people, but yes, there could be. I think there's definitely space for a stronger network of these folks. Katya, did you have something else? I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to thank John so much.
Amanda from UC Irvine had another question, John. she says at Irvine, they're working with graduate students to understand how to talk about their skills differently. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
She says, if we're in a meeting with someone at a corporation, how can we describe them, how can we describe to them what humanities graduate training offers, sort of more in general? What would be compelling to someone in the business world?
Well, I would start, and I know that's a great question, I would start with the human experience. Because 50 years ago, nobody even asked that question in technology, for instance, or really even in business. The whole idea of customer experience, human factors, it's the same thing across a variety of industries. And it's in the name itself. That's what a humanist is. Whether you're studying music or history or literature, you are an expert in analyzing the output of the human experience. And like I said, that doesn't mean that you are an expert in making that, but your input to a design team is critical because you've been studying this your whole life. Not to mention that, maybe in a little bit of a harder skill arena, you're good at synthesizing lots of pieces of data. The first thing, I'm sure you've heard this, Amanda, the lingo inside of corporate America is voluminous, for sure, but you can alter some of the parlance of academia as well. Someone who studies the great novels of the 18th century is a data scientist in a very specific form of data, and has figured out ways to parse that and pull the nuance out of it. So another thing that humanists are good at that resonates well in the private sector is pattern recognition. Looking at, large, complicated sets of things, could be paint on a canvas, could be buildings in a city, but and understanding the patterns of usage, the patterns of design, that's catnip to a lot of private sector individuals because they're trying to do the same thing in financial services or fraud detection or how to make the snowplows run better. So those are just a couple tips.
Yeah, and I think some of the other things you talked about before, like translators between disciplines or among disciplines or among teams or different groups of people. Who essentially are speaking different languages sometimes. The coders and the managers aren't always speaking the same language.
Yeah, very specifically, there was a discipline invented about 20 years ago in technology called information architect, which gives building architects hives to even hear that term. But the idea is it sits between the world of the artist, right, the person who does the visual design, and the world of the engineer, the coder, it's largely back-end, right, that is an architect of the experience of using whatever that thing is. And most of the people that I've worked with over the course of my career come from the humanities. You are not going to become an information designer or information architect coming from the hard engineering disciplines. It's just not the way you think. So that's a translator right there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that job title before. And I think sometimes for graduate students, that's part of the problem is they do feel like they may be interested in careers out, in technology. They may understand really well how to translate their experience as a graduate student, as a researcher, into that realm, but they may they may just not know what jobs to search for on Indeed.com. They may not know some of the really basic keywords that they should be looking for.
Yeah, and this is the problem with job boards. It's the problem with companies. They'll never post for something that they don't that they can't see a precedent for. I mean, I'm lucky. The only job that I've ever had that actually was posted was that first job at IBM. Everything else was kind of, make it up as you go, and that's terrifying because you don't go to Indeed.com and see these things listed. But I think it's a good idea, Maureen, to more focus not on job descriptions in their entirety, but on just key words and what are the synonyms in the academy for those words, because there are a lot. Analysis comes to mind, storytelling, or the ability to parse narrative. That's an academic way of saying, user scenario research, which the private sector would call. I mean, we almost need a dictionary of those, like an English-Spanish dictionary, but for, crossing this particular divide.
Yes, absolutely. Because I was like, oh yes, parse the story. That makes sense to me. When you say user scenario research, I would never recognize that as the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what is daunting to graduate students too is this idea. I mean, both the idea of kind of personal marketing, personal branding, and this idea of networking, that Katya was talking about too, is very intimidating for a lot of graduate students who tend to be more introverted, who tend to be more introspective, and may have a kind of aversion to those terms. Yeah, but so I think it's helpful too for them to translate some of those businessy words into more academic terms, like building intellectual communities. But I think they also need an understanding of how to talk to people like you when they do get in the room with them.
Well, all lingo is odious to the group that isn't in it. I think they'd probably say the same thing about academic language. It's a weird kind of signifier of tribalism, but it exists, and it's a really good idea. Maybe the NEH should put that dictionary together.
That would certainly be useful.
Okay.
No one
get a grant on that one.
You should partner with like the NSA or something like that. No, not the NSA.
NSA.
That's the wrong acronym. The science people. Who are they?
NSF. Yeah.
NSF.
NSF, not the NSA. Definitely not the NSA.
DHS.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. We have.
Do.
Yeah. One of our participants on the webinar says they call it ethnography and snowball sampling when talking about informational interviews and networking to try and translate for the graduate students what it is they're doing. That's the term I was not familiar with before just now. I always learn so much in these webinars.
But you know what humanists are good at? They're good at encountering, new language and new ways of phrasing things. Way better, I should think, than, folks coming in with MBAs and stuff like that. And so partially this comes down to confidence as well. I'm not saying, fake it, but, that's an analytical puzzle to be solved too. And let's face it, most people who, have been gunning for the private sector all their lives, those interviews are just as stressful for them too, because they're outsiders as well.
Yeah, I think, this confidence issue is really key. And I'm not sure our graduate programs right now are set up to enhance their students' confidence just in general. And I think that, of course, it becomes compounded when you add in issues of gender and race and social background and those kinds of things. And I think that a lot of graduate students have these narratives in their head that, they're not good enough, or they're not as smart as their peers, or maybe the reason that they're looking into, they sort of absorb these narratives that the reason they might be looking outside of academia is because they can't cut it. They couldn't be successful in that arena, and I think that's part of what's so very damaging about the system as it exists right now, and part of what my passion is in working on NextGen grants is to try and counteract those internal scripts and sometimes they're external scripts that they're getting from their mentors. And I think that's sort of psychological work that has to happen on an individual level that, I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve that today.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's a poisonous strain too, because, if people are only in these programs to be the next leaders of those programs, you're not even exploring what the larger implications of those skill sets are in other disciplines. We don't live in that world anymore. Some of the greatest breakthroughs and innovations have come from people sticking their chocolate into peanut butter and liking the way it tasted. So we've got to stop that line of thinking.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, John. And I've been getting comments about how helpful this conversation has been and how it resonates with what has been going on, the individual work that's been going on in the different NextGen campuses. And I know that this is going to be a conversation that's also going to be helpful and interesting to those who weren't able to join us live, but who will watch the recording. So I just want to reiterate Katya's thanks and to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Great. So thanks everyone for participating. As I said, this is being recorded and will be made available to everyone. As you hopefully saw from my newsletters, my recent newsletters, the white papers are due June 30th, and NEH has given some guidelines on how those might be, how those should be structured and how long they should be and that sort of thing. And all that guidance is available on the consortium website. And while you're there, register for our next webinar. It's going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be a workshop on planning inclusive programs. And that's in early June. I don't have the date right at my fingertips, but we encourage you to join us for that as well. So thank you again, and I'll talk to you soon.